Fr Paul Glynn is a Marist priest who spent many years in Japan, over 20, and I would like to ask him a few questions. Fr Paul, why Japan? Why did you go there to be a missionary?
I went to a school up in Lismore, and one of the famous people who left the school was Lionel Marsden, who was a champion rugby player, and we loved rugby.
Yes.
And then all the teachers were priests, and so some of the priests had gone through the seminary with Lionel Marsden.
Mm-hmm.
And when Singapore fell, there was no news about him.
Right.
So often they'd ask us to pray for him.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe he's dead, maybe he's still living. Mm-hmm. And then, when Singapore fell, soldiers came to the school and started a cadet corps. They gave us small rifles and taught us how to shoot, and told us that the Japanese are horrible people because they were coming close to Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And so they taught us two things: to try and shoot straight and to hate the Japanese, so we would become guerrilla fighters.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
And all through the war we had nothing but bad news about the Japanese. And at the end of the war, when the Australian prisoners of war came back, they told us how cruel the Japanese had been. And Marsden was one of them. Mm-hmm. And he gave a talk in 1945 at the end of the year, when we were thinking what to do when we leave school. And he suddenly told us he wanted to go to Japan on this mission of reconciliation. And it stunned us. Mm-hmm. Look, they're the enemy, they're evil people. Mm-hmm. And Marsden got me thinking. And then he tried to get the provincial. Mm-hmm. Well, I'll tell you what, this is how it started. His very close priest friend went to meet him when he came back from the ship, Marsden and the other POWs. And this friend of his, Father Glover, said, "What are you going to do now? You're back, to restore your health." And Marsden said, "I want to get permission to begin a mission in Japan." And the priest, no, you don't make a major decision. You're weak and you're tired." And he said, "No, I made a promise." He said, "On the Burma-Thailand Railroad, I saw a Japanese officer with a stick belting an Australian soldier for no reason. And I stepped up and saluted him. I said, 'Sir, that's against the Geneva Convention.' And he got me by the shoulders and he kicked me down the embankment. And I got up full of anger and hatred. And gradually it turned to, I had to make a choice. Am I going to continue to hate and give away my Christian ideals, or am I going to forgive him?" And he said, "I prayed to Cardinal Newman, to whom I had a devotion. And gradually I quieted down and I said, 'Jesus, I'm sorry for hating. And if I survive the war, I want to go and work for the Japanese.'" So the provincial went to Japan after the war. And he came and he said, "The Japanese are waiting for grace. They've lost their old beliefs." So I went to the seminary and we had an 8-year course, and you could volunteer to go to Oceania or Japan. So I asked to go to Japan. So that's why I was sent there.
Wonderful story. Well, I heard that you received a special medal. It's called the Order of the Rising Sun from the Emperor of Japan. How this happened?
Well, when I went to Japan, the United Nations refused to let Japan become a member. Mm-hmm. There was hatred, and I read that there were 91 sister cities in Australia with various countries, but none with Japan. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was sad. And Marsden had taught us we've got to work for reconciliation. So I wrote to my hometown, Lismore, New South Wales, to the mayor. Mm-hmm. And I said, "Would you like to become a sister city with a Japanese city?" Mm-hmm. And so the very first sister city of Japan with a foreign country was where I was working in Lismore.
Wonderful.
And good things happen from it. And fortunately, I had a brother, 2 years old, working in Japan, and the Japanese were starving. And he wrote all around the world to countries that would help the poor. He wrote to Australia, no response. They're not going to help the Japanese. New Zealand responded. And they began to send warm clothing and powdered milk. And after my brother was 6 years in Japan, he had to come back to do a second mission. And before he left, 1,000 Japanese turned up at the rectory with gifts. They had no money, but one woman gave a beautiful kimono, others gave him carvings, and he went back to Australia, and he had enough to put on an exhibition of Japanese goodwill gifts, artistic goods. Now he tried Australia, no. The big supermarket, big store where he went said, look, there could be a riot, some ex-POW could get up with a sword. No. So he wrote to New Zealand, certainly bring it over. So he travelled around 42 cities showing this and talking of, we must forgive the Japanese. And one woman went home, her husband was a high-ranking officer in the Air Force who received a very beautiful sword. The Japanese general at the surrender gave it to him. And the wife said, if you return that, that will be an act of reconciliation. Why don't you do it? And he did. So Tony comes back to Australia, and I had a brother who was the editor of our magazine. He was a Marist priest too. And he said, why are you going straight back to Japan? He said, because Australia doesn't want me. They don't want to hear this message. So my brother got on the phone and rang up the Prime Minister. And the secretary said, well, what do you want to talk about?
Who was the Prime Minister?
Menzies.
Okay.
And so he got Menzies on the phone. And he said, the Japanese sent me this beautiful goodwill exhibition, and no Australian store will show it. Leave it to me, said Menzies. And so he invited him, and he said, you must have a reception afterwards with the coffee and biscuits. How are you going to provide that? My brother said, well, I have no money. I will do that. And after that, he went to over 40 cities in Australia. Now, he went back with about 55 swords that ex-soldiers had said, this is our symbol of reconciliation. So in Japan, the samurai sword has deep meaning. The eldest son guards the sword, and they believe the spirit of the family is in the sword. And so the Japanese consulate wrapped all the swords up in white silk and put them in nice boxes. And when the captain of the ship saw these boxes coming, he said, what are they? And they said, they're swords. Whose swords? Father Glynn's. What do priests want swords for? So he got my brother to come to the cabin and heard the story. He said, I have a sword too. One moment, he went and got his sword. Take that back too, as a symbol of reconciliation. So they showed the swords in Japanese department stores, and there's a lovely photo in that book of this widow and her oldest son. The husband died in the war, with Tony handing back the sword. And so beautiful things started to happen. I followed the inspiration of my brother. He was the one that was an original thinker. And so that was the very first sister city between Japan and a foreign country. And so I started to write to people asking for help for the poor Japanese. And school teachers came along and asked me to speak to the students in English because they were learning English. And when I was going back after 5 years to Australia for the second mission, a little Japanese said, we want to come with you to Australia. And so they brought gifts and went to Lisbon, the sister city, and we had a wonderful time. And then when I started to write books, in making money. They sent the first money to the Philippines, who had suffered very much from the Japanese army. The woman helped me and said, send it to the Philippines first, because the Japanese army did terrible things there.
Yeah.
So newspaper reporters would come along and why are you helping Japan? You're an Australian, that's the enemy country. And I said, well, it's important to have reconciliation. And so they started to write stories about these, especially about Tony Glynn, my brother. So Tony Glynn received the Order of the Rising Sun from the Emperor, and he lived very poorly, and on the way in the train he got up and his trousers split. They were old trousers, you see. This Japanese woman said, I have a needle copper, and she showed up the trousers. And so I went back to Australia and I started to give talks and write books like this one here. And so the
song for Nagasaki. Yes.
This man was a man of reconciliation. Before I wrote
the man you wrote about in this book. Yes.
That's right. I went to Hiroshima and then Nagasaki on the anniversaries. Was this man Nagai brought spirituality in a commemoration of the Pacific War and the Vietnam Wars. And I fell in love with this man, Dr. Nagai. He was such a beautiful character. When he became a Catholic, he joined the St Vincent De Paul. And on his second tour of Japan as a doctor with the military, he wrote to the St Vincent De Paul in Japan. The old Chinese and the children were suffering, so they began to send him gifts. And he found Chinese members of the St Vincent De Paul who would give the gifts out. And so beautiful things started to happen.
Wonderful.
So Australia gave me the Order of Australia.
So you got the Order of Australia medal as well, but the Order of the Rising Sun came from the Japanese Emperor.
That's right.
Because of this collaboration and helping the Japanese children, yes?
That's right.
Okay, and also you helped the Philippines as well, the poor children of the Philippines. Wonderful.
I didn't mention America, but when I wrote that book, we started to make a lot of money.
Yes.
And and we got to have sent over $1 million to poor countries.
No matter of nationality or race or color, we help other people just because we are human beings. Wonderful. And this book was translated into 13 languages, yes?
13 languages.
Okay. Wonderful.
One of the first was Polish. A Polish priest in Japan read the book and he said, look, we must get this into Polish. And Poland was suffering at the time.
Yes.
And he said, how much would it cost to get the... And I said, it won't cost anything. Because Poland is going through bad times financially.
Yes.
And the Catholic Church is being persecuted. You can have the book. And so then he got the second book about this rag picker. This aristocratic Japanese young lady who could trace her family back to the 10th century in Kyoto, where there were Shinto priests. And this woman was led by Zeno, after her baptism, was led by Brother Zeno to this slum where people living in great poverty. And see, in the last bombing of Japan, Tokyo, I'm sorry, over 100,000 died. So Tokyo was horrible. Over 300 B-29 bombers went there. Once they captured islands they could take off and return with bombers. And this night, the top flyers went in and bombed across in fire. And the other planes were told to bomb around that cross to trap the citizens. They couldn't get out. And over 100 million died. And so this was this very aristocratic woman with a friend wandering around a city south of Tokyo, Yokohama, and there was this open Catholic church, and they went in, and she didn't know why, but the statue of a woman, which is Our Lady of the Lord, spoke to her heart, she said. She didn't know who the woman was. And she went to see some Spanish nuns, and they said that was Our Lady, told her the story of the Lord. She took instructions and was baptized. There was a reporter who was angry. He hated all religion, but he wanted to help the poor. So he rang up several newspapers and said, this young aristocratic woman is working in the slums and she's going to have a Christmas, and if you want to introduce you to her. So along came the media, and she was quite a beautiful young woman with all these dirty kids, and from then off she appeared often in the newspapers. They kept following Zeno for stories, and Zeno said, we've got to advertise the teaching of Jesus. So he would tell newspaper reporters what he was doing, and he would cut out the cuttings of what he was doing, and he would say, this is my ticket for trains. So he'd tell the station master, look what I'm doing. So the station master would let him in for no money, you see. And one time in Nagasaki, he takes this professor, a friend of Dr. Nagai's, to visit the American camp. And as they get closer, Professor said, but what introduction do you have? How do we get in? God will provide. And along comes an American jeep, and it so happened this Polish American in the army. Hello, Father, can I help you? Oh, yes. And so in they drive, and more articles in the newspapers about Zeno and about the work they're doing. And Zeno was he never went to school, because in the east of Poland, if you went to school, it was all in Russian. And so many of the parents said no, and they don't need it. So he became a jack of all trades. He could mend boots and repair buildings, and he became a real simple Franciscan that lived on Providence. And all of Japan came to love him. And when John Paul II came to Japan, he knew about Zeno, he heard about Zabrowski. And so there's that lovely photo, tears running down old Zeno's face. He's now an old man. And John Paul II smiling at him and congratulating him.
There is a story about a Catholic priest and a Catholic nun who begged for money together with some Buddhists. Could you tell us something about this?
Zen Buddhism, part of the thing you must go begging. And I said, we have Francis of Assisi who was begging. What about, it'll be Christmas in a week's time, what if we go every day on the streets, Buddhists and Catholics, asking for help for the Bangladeshi. And we've got the Buddhist nuns, there'd be a Buddhist nun and a Catholic nun together, and with a begging box, and a Buddhist priest and a Catholic priest. So money flowed in. So it was just a sheer happy time. And people would say, my grandfather was a Christian and my family Buddhist. And it's wonderful to see Buddhists and Catholics working together. So this idea of reconciliation became very important.
Father Paul, can you tell us a story about the man who became a Catholic after reading a secret police notes from the church?
A Japanese bishop said, start kindergartens, because I'm going to send diocesan priests, and kindergartens give a revenue. There were so few Catholics in Japan, and so I built this kindergarten, and I got as a head teacher to run the kindergarten and to teach catechism too. This woman, her name was Takeda-san, Takeda Sensei. Sensei means teacher. And she told me a story that when the war started, she was the catechist to a French priest. Now, he was put into a concentration camp. But when France surrendered and became Vichy France, he was allowed to come back to the church. And she told me every Sunday, a little while before the homily, a young policeman would turn up with a notebook. And as he spoke, he'd be writing down, in case he's some sort of a spy working against the Japanese. And he belonged to what was called the Kempei type, the thought police, like Gestapo or the SS in the Nazis. And one day, he came along and said, the chief of police wants to see you immediately. Now the chief of police was always Kempei type. And so with fear, she went along with him. And to her great surprise, he took her to a hospital. When he knocked on the door, ushered her in, and the chief of police said, I had a spy in your catechism class. He wrote down very obediently everything you said. I read it carefully every week to see there was nothing anti-Japanese, anti-war. And he said, gradually I came to believe. I believe now. Can I be baptized? He was baptized and had a big Catholic funeral to the embarrassment of the secret police, because they were preaching anything foreign as their enemy. Catholicism our enemy. But there he was, given a lovely Catholic funeral with only a few Japanese Catholics, but they all turned up and sang hymns in Japanese. It was wonderful.
Wonderful
So,
story.
the power of the word.
Exactly.
The unbeliever reading it, not believing it, but gradually he's converted.
Father Paul, could you share with us a story about a young Japanese girl who desired to be baptized, but unfortunately she passed away before the day of baptism?
At Christmas came, my first, as a parish priest, not knowing much language, this doctor came from the university hospital. He said that the hospital is full of tuberculosis patients. Now, I'm not a Christian, but you Christians do good things at Christmas time. Could you come along and give some encouragement? He said, with tuberculosis, if you give up hope, you die. Can you give them some hope? And so I discussed with my Christians. They said, there's a beautiful movie out on Dr. Nagai of Nagasaki called The Bells of Nagasaki, produced by one of the top film companies in Japan, a commercial movie, but it's beautiful and it gives people hope. So I said, right, we'll go along and show that movie. Now, one of the tubercular patients, as one result, asked to be instructed in Catholicism. And one of the laymen would go there, because I didn't know much Japanese, because we had a church front store. It was just beginning, and the bishop said to us, the first ones, look, learn Japanese in Romaji, Tokyo, T-O-K-Y-O, with strokes over the long O's. He said because the price of land will go up. And we were there to start mainly churches for the Japanese secular priests. And so that was a big problem of not knowing the language. So this Catholic in the Legion of Mary would go along to this hospital and teach Catholicism, and especially this one very sick girl of tuberculosis. And suddenly she stopped asking, and she died. And this catechist was very upset that she didn't finish the baptism. But then a Catholic woman in the church came along and said, I went to her a day before she died, and she asked me for help, and I said, would you like to wear this medal, the miraculous medal? Oh yes, she said. So she died with the medal, not baptized, but believing in God and asking Mary's help. They were simple days, and this old storefront church didn't look like a church at all. And these early Catholics, I remember one was a Protestant, or had been, and she said during the war her baby got sick and she strapped it on her back and ran to the doctor, And the doctor said, too late, the baby's dead. Now, she said, later on, I became a Catholic, and I heard Matthew 24 for the first time. Who gets into heaven? Jesus said, I was hungry, you gave me to eat. I was in prison, you visited me. Oh, she said, that's beautiful. Yeah, people who are not baptized can get into heaven. And our families didn't do that. And so there was great comfort that this baby of hers could be in heaven.
Wonderful stories. Father Paul, thank you so much for spending this time with me and with all those who watched this video. And thank you so much for your time in front of your TVs or computers. We might record another video about Brother Zenon Żebrowski. He's a very popular monk, Franciscan in Japan, but that's probably a different story. Thank you so much once again. God bless you, Father.
Thank you for your hospitality.
Thank you.